Hello and welcome to this lecture, and in this lecture we are going to talk something about the different types of errors and the different types of exceptions that you are going to face while writing Python code. So let's imagine that you're writing a bunch of Python code for developing any application or any website. So while writing the code, even if you are an experienced programmer, still you will encounter some errors along the way. Hence, it is extremely important to know the different kinds of errors and see how these errors can be identified. So we will discuss about a few errors, as well as we are going to discuss about what are exceptions in Python. So let's first start with the simple type of error, which is the syntax error. So syntax error is an error wherein you actually type in incorrect syntax for a particular code. So to understand what is a syntax error, let's take a simple example. So let's first define a function. So let's type in def and let's name this as function1, and let's say this function is actually used to add up two numbers. So let's type in a comma b. So let's say that a and b are two numbers, and let's say this function actually prints out the addition of the two numbers. So we will type print a plus b. So once we have this function, we could go ahead and directly call the function by typing function and simply passing in some values to this function. So let's say we pass in 2 and 3 as values. Now once you actually pass these values, what is going to happen is that the code is going to get executed normally. So if you save the code and if you run this, as you could see, you will get an addition of 5. Now what if you actually miss out on some syntax? That is, the correct syntax to define a function is like this, but let's say that you have missed a colon over here. So this is a good example of having a bad syntax. So now if you try to save the code and if you try to run this code, as you could see, you are going to get a syntax error. So syntax error is, you could say, a grammatical programming error. That is, you don't follow the rules or the proper syntax for that particular language. So the Python syntax for defining a function is actually you type def, then the function name, then the parameters, and the Python syntax states that you should have a colon right over here. So if you do some mistakes like that, then you are going to have a syntax error in your code. So this was all about syntax errors, and you could have syntax errors in many different ways. Let's say you miss out on some bracket over here, or let's say you miss out on a plus sign over here. So in that case, you will have a syntax error. So that was all about syntax error. Now let's move on to the next type of error, which is called as the logical error. Now the logical error is actually quite difficult to detect because the compiler or your interpreter cannot actually determine your logical error. So let's take a simple example to understand what a logical error is. So let's say you have defined this function which is going to add up two numbers, and as you have to add up two numbers, you type in a plus b right over here. Now what if by mistake, instead of specifying a plus sign over here, you put a multiplication sign or a minus sign? So in that case, if you run the code, you are going to still get an output for the code, but the thing is that your output won't be accurate. So for example, let's say you have something like 2 and 2 here, and if you're writing code to actually add two numbers, and if you run it, you will get a correct output because you might think that 2 plus 2 is actually equal to 4. So your function might work for this set of values, but when you type in some other value like 2 and 3, your code is not going to perform as expected. So this type of error is called as a logical error, and this is altogether different from the syntax error. So syntax error is basically an error which is caused due to an improper syntax, and logical error is caused due to us. Now the logical error is a bit difficult to determine because you don't get any line numbers or you don't get any error on the output console. So it is extremely difficult in some cases to find out exactly where the logical error lies. The theoretical answer is infinity, but as we all know, there is no actual way to define infinity in computers. So what this is going to do here is that it is going to raise a divide by zero exception error. So in this case, if you divide a number by zero, so if you save the code and if you try to run it, as you could see, you will get a zero division error, that is division by zero. So these type of things are actually called as exceptions, and what exceptions do is that they don't allow your code to run further. So let's say you have one more line of code right after this function. So let me just type in a simple line to print out hello over here. So in this case, if you try to run the code, as you could see, when you execute it, the exception occurs right here because the computer cannot divide any number by zero. Hence, as the exception occurs, it is not going to further execute the code which is written after it. So exceptions are extremely fatal to your code, and you actually need a way to handle exceptions. And the way of handling exceptions is actually called as exception handling. So exception handling is an extremely important concept in programming in almost any programming language, because what happens is that, let's imagine that you are developing a website or any web application, and in that case, if a user enters a value which might cause an exception, then your website is going to crash and the user is going to get an unexpected output. Henceforth, in order to avoid those situations, we always use exception handling so that each and every type of exception can be handled. Now, this might sound a little bit overwhelming, but the concept of exception handling is extremely simple. So actually, there are different types of exceptions. There is an exception which is called as import error, wherein you import some module and you have error importing that module. So that's it for this tutorial, and I hope you guys understood different types of errors and exceptions. So in the next tutorial, we will learn a way to handle exceptions, which is called as exception handling. So thank you very much for watching this lecture, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture. Thank you.